Ever wondered if those powerful AI companions we use every day, large language models, always reach for the most complex solution possible? Or do they, maybe like a seasoned detective, have a knack for finding the simplest explanation? Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really groundbreaking study that uncovers a surprising, almost intuitive bias in transformers. It's something the researchers call in context Occam's razor.
Yeah, and we're going to explore how transformers, leveraging this unique ability they have known as in-context learning, actually manage to pinpoint and favor the simplest sufficient explanation for the information you provide. Even when, more intricate explanations are technically possible, think of it as a kind of finely tuned internal compass guiding them towards parsimony.
Right. So our mission today is to understand precisely how this simplicity preference operates, why it's not just some clever trick, but actually profoundly significant, and also what factors truly influence it. We're extracting the most crucial insights from this compelling research, and I promise you, by the end of this deep dive, your perspective on how these models learn might just, well, fundamentally shift. Okay, so to set the stage, let's first clarify. What exactly is in-context learning, often called ICL?
Right, so ICL is really a fundamental capability of large language models. It kind of sets them apart, means they can adapt to completely new tasks pretty much on the fly just by being shown a few examples directly within the context or the prompt you give them. There's no need for like internal parameter updates or any retraining. It's a bit like a seasoned chess player, maybe after seeing a few new opening moves, immediately adapting their strategy for the whole game, without needing to relearn the fundamentals of chess.
That's quite a feat for an AI, really is. But here's the twist that makes it truly fascinating. Real-world tasks aren't always neatly packaged at just one complexity level, are they? They often present what the researchers termed hierarchical task complexity.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. Imagine a situation where a very straightforward pattern could also be perfectly described by a much more elaborate rule. For instance, think of an order one Markov chain. That's where the next item depends only on the one right before it. Well, that can be perfectly represented as just a specific instance of an order 3 Markov chain, where the next item considers, say, 3 preceding ones. So this creates this inherent ambiguity, like a choice point for the model.
Okay, so when confronted with data that fits both a simple and a more complex explanation, what happens? Do these powerful transformers just default to the most expressive complex explanation simply because they can? Or do they effectively discern and choose the simplest sufficient one? What was the researchers' main hypothesis about how transformers would navigate these hierarchical complexities?
Yeah. Well, their hypothesis, and ultimately their finding too, was that these models do indeed exhibit a preference for simplicity. When faced with this kind of ambiguity, they tend to select the most parsimonious explanation.
And what did the researchers actually discover? Did it pan out?
It did. The answer, perhaps surprisingly, leans towards simplicity.
Ah, so they truly do pick the simplest sufficient hypothesis. Okay, let's delve into the compelling experimental evidence then.
Right. So the researchers meticulously designed these controlled environments, test beds, they call them, to explore this very thing. One involved Markov chains. These are certainly mathematical models for sequences where the probability the next item depends on previous ones. They trained transformers on sequences generated from both order 1 and order 3 Markov chains. And remember, as we said, any order 1 chain can be perfectly represented by an order 3 chain. What they observed was pretty remarkable. At inference time, when the model was actually making predictions, it successfully recognized the true underlying order of the process that generated the sequence. So when given an order 1 sequence, its internal processing primarily relied on bidgram statistics, effectively looking at pairs of tokens. But then when given order 3 sequence, it fluidly switched to using tetragram statistics, considering groups of 4 tokens.
Wow, okay, so this means the transformer didn't just default to the higher complexity of tetragrams for everything, even though it absolutely had the capacity to do that. It intelligently chose the simpler, more efficient model when that was appropriate. It's kind of like asking you to write a brief report, and you choose the clearest, most concise language needed, right? You don't use the most convoluted academic jargon just because you know it.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And another compelling test bed they used was linear regression, which is a common statistical method. They set up 2 scenarios, a complex one that utilized all D features available and a simple one where only half D2 features actually had an impact. So the other half were essentially noise or irrelevant. And crucially, the complex model could perfectly explain the simple one. It contained the simple one within it, so to speak. The results were very telling. When given sequences generated by the simple regressor, The transformer's predictions overwhelmingly gravitated towards a D2-dimensional solution, the simpler one. This was especially clear in a specific range of context length, where both the simple and complex solutions could technically fit the given data perfectly. But conversely, when presented with data that actually came from the complex regressor, it accurately aligned with the full dimensional solution.
Okay, this really embodies Occam's razor then, doesn't it? When two explanations fit the data equally well, the transformer consistently chooses the simpler one.
It does, and they didn't stop there. They also validated this behavior on probabilistic context-free grammars, or PCFGs. These are systems of rules for generating sequences, but they have varying levels of sort of hidden structural complexity. And again, they confirm this simplicity bias.
That's quite thorough, but perhaps the most compelling evidence, for me anyway, comes from testing this on a real-world, pre-trained large language model. GPT-4, is that right?
Yes, exactly. They tested GPT-4 using Boolean function tasks, essentially logic problems. They had a simple function, like, say, the output equals the first input bit, and a complex function, maybe something like the output is based on the majority value of 3 specific input bits. Then they designed prompts where the correct labels could be either ambiguous, meaning both the simple and complex functions produce the same output for those examples, or the labels could only be explained by the complex function.
And the results with GPT-4?
When presented with those ambiguous examples, GPT-4 consistently, really consistently, opted for the simple function to make its predictions. It was only when the examples could exclusively be explained by the complex function that GPT-4 effectively learned and applied that more intricate function.
Wow. So what this highlights is that this isn't just some peculiar trait of small synthetic models cooked up in a lab. It's a fundamental property inherent in powerful, off-the-shelf LLMs like GPT-4 operating right now.
Exactly. So what does this all mean for our understanding of AI? I mean, where do we go from here?
The researchers offer a pretty powerful theoretical justification for this behavior. They frame it using a Bayesian approach. Essentially, they suggest that transformers effectively implement an in-context Bayesian Occam's razor.
Okay, hold on. Bayesian Occam's razor. That sounds like a real heavyweight concept. Can you maybe break that down for us, make it feel less like a textbook? Absolutely, I'll try. Imagine the model is kind of weighing different possible explanations or hypotheses for the data it sees. This Bayesian framework reveals that the model's final output isn't just based on one hypothesis. It's actually a blend, a mixture of predictions from different complexity levels. And each prediction is weighted by how probable that particular hypothesis is, given the data the model has seen.
Okay, weighted by probability. Makes sense.
Right. And these probabilities depend on two main things. First, how well your model actually fits the observed data that's called the empirical likelihood. Does it explain what it sees? And second, there's a penalty for complexity, a model complexity penalty.
Ah, a penalty. Okay.
Yeah. So for truly simple data, like our order 1 Markov chain example, both the simple and the complex models might fit the data perfectly well. They both explain it. However, the simpler model incurs a much smaller complexity penalty. It's less costly for the model to consider. For Markov chains, for instance, this penalty is proportional to v to the power of s, where v is vocabulary size and s is the order. So it grows fast with complexity. This penalty term dramatically favors the simpler hypothesis, making the model naturally gravitate towards it.
Got it. So simplicity is cheaper, basically.
In a sense, yes. But if the data genuinely comes from a complex process, then the empirical likelihood term for the complex model becomes significantly better. It just fits the data much, much more accurately. And this improvement in fit becomes large enough to outweigh that complexity penalty, leading the transformer to correctly select the more complex, higher-order model.
So it's not just about finding any fit. It's about finding the, let's say, the cleanest, most efficient fit that still properly explains the data. That really is the heart of Occam's razor in action.
Precisely. And while this bias seems remarkably robust, the researchers also looked into factors that influence its strength and maybe how quickly it emerges during the model's training.
Okay, let's dig into those factors. That sounds important. First off, what happens if you only train a transformer on highly complex tasks, like only the hard stuff? Do they still manage to find the simple solution when they eventually see simple data?
That's a key question, and intriguingly, the answer is no. The research shows that if a transformer is trained exclusively on complex tasks like only those order 3 Markov chains or only the full-dimensional linear regressions, it actually struggles. It struggles to generalize down to lower order or simpler statistics when it's later presented with simpler data. This really highlights a critical point. Exposure to diverse complexity levels during training seems absolutely essential for this Occam's razor behavior to properly emerge. You need the mix.
That's a really key insight. Okay. What about the amount of context provided to the model? The length of the prompt. Does more context help?
Generally, yes, it does seem to help. Longer context lengths significantly assist the model in differentiating between complexity levels and, confidently choosing the most appropriate one. Performance can indeed suffer with very short context. It makes it harder for the model to sort of discern the true underlying simplicity or complexity. For example, with the order 1 sequences, they saw a consistently good match to BGRM statistics across different context lengths as long as it wasn't too short.
Right. And what about the actual mixture, the proportion of simple versus complex tasks during the training itself? Does that ratio matter?
Yes, the training mixture proportion, as they called it, definitely has an impact. What they found was the transformer reliably learned to identify simple order 1 sequences, even when those sequences constituted a relatively small fraction of the overall training data. That was quite robust. However, learning the more complex tetragram statistics needed for the order 3 sequences became increasingly challenging as the proportion of simple order 1 sequences increased in the training mix. Interestingly, they noted that using larger batch sizes during training could help mitigate this imbalance somewhat.
Okay, practical implications there. And does the sheer size of the model, the scale, play a role in this bias? Bigger models, better bias.
Yes, model scale does have a noticeable effect. Larger transformer models, the ones with more parameters, more embedding dimensions, layers, attention heads, all that, they still exhibit this Occam's razor-like bias. And fascinatingly, they tend to converge faster, which means they learn this sophisticated simplicity preference more quickly during training.
Faster learning. Okay. This brings up a really interesting point. Is this simplicity bias something unique to transformers, or do other AI architectures show it too? What did the researchers find when they compared them to, say, LSTMs?
That's a great question. And they did look at LSTMs, which are another common type of neural network often used for sequential data. LSTMs process information quite differently, with a more explicit kind of memory state. What they found was that LSTMs exhibited a weaker form of this Occam's razor-like inductive bias, much weaker, actually. They required significantly more model capacity, bigger models, to consistently select the correct underlying Markov chain order compared to the transformers. This strongly suggests that this valuable bias might be more inherent, perhaps even emergent from, the transformer architecture itself.
So wrapping this up, what we've unpacked today is, well, it's truly remarkable. Transformers, especially when they're trained on tasks of varying complexity, don't just blindly apply the most powerful tools they have available. They demonstrate this natural, almost intuitive preference for simplicity. They embody Occam's razor right there in their in-context learning.
Absolutely. And this in-context Bayesian-Occam's razor is far more than just a neat scientific finding, right? It suggests that 6 kind of principal hypothesis selection might be an intrinsic inductive bias property of transformers, especially when they're trained on diverse task distributions like they often are. And if that's the case, it could significantly contribute to their really impressive generalization capabilities when they face the complexities of real-world data and tasks.
Yeah, and that leads to a really important question for you, the listener, to maybe ponder. If our most advanced AI models inherently seek the simplest sufficient explanation, what fundamental truths about learning or discovery, or maybe even intelligence itself, might this preference reveal? And thinking further, what other razors or underlying principles might these powerful systems be implicitly learning that we haven't even begun to discover yet? Something to chew on until our next deep dive.